Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for being here. My talk today will deal with choice of aspect in a Russian modal construction. Of course, when talking about Russian aspect, many questions arise, but today I will try to show you how sometimes both aspects are grammatically acceptable in the same context. Here is the overview of my talk. So first I will outline my hypothesis and research questions, and then I will show you two parts of the study that I conducted. First a corpus study and then an experiment with native speakers. And for both these parts I used statistical methods to analyze my data. The starting point of this research is a work by Yand and Reynolds published in 2019, in which they conducted an experiment with 501 native speakers of Russian in order to rate the acceptability of aspects in different contexts. And in a previous work, they had already distinguished between categorical and overlapping contexts. Categorical contexts are contexts in which only one aspect is grammatically acceptable, while overlapping contexts are those contexts in which both aspects are correct. In this study, they found out that 17% of their data was populated by overlapping context, and this portion was mainly constituted by modal constructions and imperatives. Already Forsyth, just to name one, had stated that in modal constructions, such as, for example, modal constructions of necessity and obligation, both aspects are often grammatically acceptable. So the conclusion that Yande Reynolds came to is that choice of aspect is not always determined by context, so it's not always redundant, but can also be open to construal. And the aim of my study is to provide more evidence for this result and to investigate a little bit more that 17%. So I decided to choose one modal construction, namely the construction with приходится прийтись, and try to demonstrate that in this construction both aspects in the infinitive are grammatically acceptable. My research questions are the following. I would like to see if there is any grammatical factor that influences the choice of aspect, and I would like to see if I can say that choice of aspect is open to construal in this construction. To do so, as I said, I conducted first a corpus study and then an experiment with native speakers. So let us start from the corpus study. The construction that I chose, as I said, is the one with the modal verb приходится прийтись, have to, and in order to have a better control of the data, I decided to choose one specific pair of verbs, namely the pair делать, сделать, to do. As you can see here, in this construction, there can also be a noun phrase in the dative form that expresses the agent. And since делать is a transitive verb, a noun phrase in the accusative that expresses the direct object. In one, you have an example. Их родителям пришлось делать незапланированный ремонт, where родителям is in the dative plural, пришлось is the modal verb in the past perfective form, and делать is the infinitive imperfective. So I then collect data from the new version of the Russian National Corpus, and I considered all the examples that weren't older than the 50s. The distribution of data is illustrated in Table 1, and as you can see, we have very interesting figures with прийтись, because the distribution of the two aspects is almost equal, whereas we have more skewed distribution for приходится, for the imperfective modal verb. So it seems that приходится strongly prefers the perfective. For this reason, only for this part, for the corpus study, I decided to focus only on прийтись. So my final data set is made up of 447 examples, and data are distributed as you can see in the table. After collecting the data, I annotated all the examples for several factors. First of all, the aspect of the infinitive делать or сделать, then the tense of the modal verb, past, пришлось, or non-past, придется, the direct object, whether it was singular, plural, absent, or a pronoun, and by pronoun I mean a relative or interrogative or demonstrative or indefinite pronoun. I look for a dative or an agent, and for anything that modifies or determines the context. And this is because Diviak, in a study published in 2009, demonstrated that the position generic versus specific state of affairs influences the choice of modal construction of aspect in modal constructions, and so I wanted to check this result in my data. I looked also for negation, so when Beatrice is negated, and for the direct object position, if it comes before or after the construction. Here in this table you can have a look at the distribution of the factors. We can see that we only have 20 examples in which the modal construction is negated. We have a majority of singular direct objects, and we have quite a few agents and modifiers. So after annotating the data, I ran a card test on my dataset with aspect of the infinitive as the dependent variable and all the others that you see here as independent variables. And the outcome is the one that you see here in this plot. So it seems that the direct object position is the only factor that significantly splits the data into two nodes, and with a highly significant p-value. So when the direct object comes before the construction, here we have node 2 with 113 examples, and the 76% of this data is imperfective. So it seems that when the direct object is preposed, we have a tendency to have imperfective in the infinitive. On the other hand, in node 3, we have 334 examples in which the direct object comes after the construction, and in this case we have 56% of perfectives and a 44% of imperfectives. We can now have a look in more detail at what's in node 2. So in node 2 we have that 29 cases out of 113 have a pronoun as direct object, as in example 2. Нет, ты представляешь, что мне пришлось делать? Now, can you imagine what I had to do? So here, что is a relative pronoun, and therefore it couldn't have come in another position. It has to be preposed. But we also have in node 2 84 cases in which the direct object is either a noun or a pronoun that could have also been postposed, as in example 3. Потому что в последующие годы это все равно придется делать. Because in the following years this will have to be done anyway. So это here is the demonstrative pronoun that functions as the direct object, and it comes before the construction, but it could have also been postposed. In example number 4 we have a noun with a numeral as a direct object. 2 укола пришлось делать, I had to do injections. And here it looks like the focus of the sentence is the direct object and not the action itself. I tried to find an explanation for this kind of behavior, and actually it reminded me of what Grön in his doctoral thesis called presuppositional imperfective. So when he was talking about general factual imperfective. So he noticed that when the focus falls on some other part of the sentence and not on the verb tends to be imperfective. But of course, this is only my intuition, and it would need further investigation and support. So let us now sum up the distribution of these nodes. So in node 2, we see that we have only 24 pronouns with the imperfective, like the relative pronoun that we saw in example 2. And we have 59 examples with a direct object that is a singular or a plural or a pronoun that could have also come postposed. in which the aspect is imperfective. In Node 3, the distribution looks very different. So we have very few pronouns with a slight majority of perfectives. And we have a majority of perfectives also with the nouns, but the distribution here is less skewed than the one in Node 2. So if we consider only this portion of the data, so the one with imperfective, infinitive, and a direct object that comes before the construction, and it's not the kind of pronoun that we see on the left, we see that this portion of data corresponds to the 13% of the whole dataset. So further investigation is needed to confirm that when the direct object comes before the construction, we have an imperfective. I also ran another statistical test to check the variable importance. I used the aspect infinitive as the dependent variable again, and all the other independent variables as before. And as you can see from the dot chart and the table, the direct object position is the most significant factor, followed by dative, modifier, and direct object. But unfortunately, the modifier here is not significant enough to confirm the result by Diviak, according to which the opposition generic versus specific state of affairs is an influential factor for the choice of aspect. So if we do not consider the direct object position as a significant factor for the reasons that I have explained so far, we can conclude that aspect choice is independent of linguistic context. Now let us look at the experiment with native speakers. So I designed a questionnaire with 17 examples, and this time I included also examples with the modal verb prichaditsa, so with the imperfective form of the modal verb. And I also decided to use examples with 3 specific direct objects that are shak, vid, and viber. So the construction would translate into have to take a step, have to pretend, or have to make a choice. I submitted every example into different versions, the original one with the original aspect and another one with the opposite aspect, for a total of 34 questions. I asked participants to evaluate the acceptability of every example by choosing between nevazможно, impossible, dopustima, acceptable, and отлично, excellent. And I also added a facultative question to ask for metalinguistic comments on their perception about the choice of aspect, but due to time reason, I won't have the possibility here to go into detail about the answers to this question. I collected 110 answers from Russian native speakers, older than 18 years old, born and educated in Russia, and with a minimal high school educational level. And in this figure, you can see what the task looked like. So after collecting the answers, I annotated them for several factors. First of all, the answer itself, so if it was impossible, acceptable, or excellent. Then the direct object, whether it was shak, vid, or viber. The original aspect, so the aspect of the infinitive in the original version. I wanted to see if the aspect evaluated matched the original or not. I looked for the aspect of the modal verb, so if it was prichaditsa or pritis, and I assigned a random code to each answer in order to identify them. Here on the right, we can see this graph with the distribution of the answers according to the factors answer, original aspect, and matches original. So in blue we have impossible ratings, in orange we have acceptable ratings, and in gray we have excellent ratings. And for example, here on the left, we can see examples in which the original aspect was perfective, but examples that didn't match with the original. So the participant has to rate an imperfective that originally was a perfective. And here we see that this is the only case in which the highest number of ratings are acceptable ratings, while in all the other cases, the highest number of responses is atlično responses. And if we look at the distribution considering only nevozможно as opposed to допустимо and atlično responses altogether, we can see that in all 4 cases, even when the example didn't match the original, we have a very high number of positive responses. And this would lead us to conclude that both aspects are grammatically acceptable and that the choice doesn't depend on anything in the context, but that is the speaker that chooses which aspect to use. Then I ran a logistic regression with mixed effects on the results of the experiment. This is the model that best fitted the data, so I considered answer as the dependent variable, matches the original direct object and aspect of the modal verb as independent variables, and I also included person ID as a random variable. In the table here, you can look at the results of the test. The intercept corresponds to the values no for matches original, shag for direct object, and imperfective for the aspect of the modal verb. And what the test did was comparing the probability of having acceptable or excellent ratings with the probability of having impossible ratings. So as we can see here, when the example matches the original, we have a higher probability to have a positive response, so a допустимо or atlično response. The same goes for precis as the aspect of the modal verb. And this is probably due to the fact that prefaditsa is very restrictive and strongly prefers an imperfective, as we also saw in one of the first slides from the Corpus Study. As far as the direct object is concerned, we can see that the effect size is less significant, but in general, both Weber and Witt have a high probability to trigger a positive evaluation. And this is probably due to the fact that dělat or dělat shag is, so take a step, is a physical action that per se is single, punctual, and resultative. We can draw now some conclusions. So from the Corpus Study, we saw that when the direct object is preposed, there is a tendency to have an imperfective. But as we had already said, further research is needed to confirm this result. If we do not consider this factor, we can claim that grammatical context wasn't a strong constraint on the choice of aspect. From the experiment, we saw that both aspects are evaluated by native speakers as grammatically acceptable most of the times. We found a tendency for prefaditsa to prefer the imperfective, while precis is more flexible and accepts both aspects. And we can conclude that the choice is up to the speaker and the meaning he or she wants to convey. So we can say that our hypothesis is confirmed, and in this construction, both aspects in the infinitive are grammatically acceptable. And to answer our research questions, we can say that no grammatical factor strongly influences the choice of aspect, and therefore we can claim that choice of aspect is to some extent open to construal in this construction. Thank you very much for your attention. Here are some references, and I'm looking forward to your questions, comments, and discussion. Thank you.